HOA enforcers tried to arrest my kid, but they don't know I'm state police. My name is Daniel, and for most of my adult life, I have worn a badge and carried the weight of duty that comes with being a state police officer. Out in the world, my presence alone is often enough to keep chaos in check. But at home, in the quiet suburban neighborhood where my family and I had decided to build our lives, I thought I had finally found a place of peace, a place where law and order would be less about enforcing rules and more about community harmony. I couldn't have been more wrong. We had moved into the neighborhood about 3 years ago, lured by its promise of safety, manicured lawns, and a supposed sense of belonging. The glossy brochures had painted it as the perfect slice of suburban heaven, where kids could ride bikes down tree-lined streets and families could enjoy backyard barbecues without a care in the world. What those brochures didn't tell us was that this paradise came with watchful eyes, endless rules, and an HOA board that wielded power like a private militia. At first, I brushed it off. As a police officer, I knew rules had their place. After all, structure was what kept chaos at bay. But soon I realized this was different. The HOA wasn't about community, it was about control. Every blade of grass had to be measured, every trash can hidden, every vehicle parked at just the right angle. And while I found their pettiness frustrating, I tried to stay under the radar. My focus was on my family, especially my 12-year-old son, Ethan, who was the reason we had chosen this neighborhood in the first place. Ethan had always been a curious, adventurous boy. He loved playing outside, exploring the woods behind our street, and skateboarding on the smooth sidewalks. To him, the neighborhood felt like a giant playground, and I wanted him to have that freedom, the kind of childhood that was becoming increasingly rare in our world. I taught him responsibility, respect, and caution, but I never wanted him to grow up afraid of living. Unfortunately, the HOA saw his childhood differently. It started small. Notes slipped under our door, complaints about Ethan leaving his skateboard near the porch, or accusations that he was riding, too fast, on the sidewalks. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was nothing more than nosy neighbors with too much time on their hands. But those notes soon turned into formal warnings. And the warnings turned into threats. Still, I didn't think much of it. After all, what could an HOA really do? They were supposed to manage the common areas, not dictate how a 12-year-old spent his afternoons. I underestimated them. One warm afternoon, I was in the kitchen finishing up paperwork when I noticed Ethan hadn't returned from riding his bike. Normally, he'd be back within an hour, sweaty and smiling, demanding something cold to drink. But the hour stretched into 2, and I began to feel that creeping anxiety every parent knows too well. I stepped outside and scanned the street, but there was no sign of him. Just as I was about to get in my car to look for him, I heard raised voices coming from the community park at the end of the block. My heart raced as I hurried toward the sound, and what I saw made my blood run cold. 3 men wearing HOA security uniforms, yes, they actually had their own uniforms, were surrounding Ethan. My son stood frozen with his bike at his side, his eyes wide with fear. One of the enforcers had a clipboard in hand, while the other 2 stood uncomfortably close to him, arms crossed, as if they were dealing with a criminal. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to process what I was seeing. These men, these self-appointed enforcers of neighborhood order, were treating my 12-year-old son as if he were some kind of delinquent. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough to understand the gravity of what was happening. They were accusing him of reckless behavior, for riding his bike too fast near the park, claiming he had endangered the safety of other children. And then, to my absolute disbelief, I heard one of them say something about taking him into custody until his parents arrived. Custody. That word echoed in my ears like a gunshot. Who did they think they were? My instincts as a police officer surged forward, but so did my instincts as a father. No one, not a criminal on the streets, not a bully in a schoolyard, and certainly not a power-hungry HOA officer, was going to put their hands on my son. I felt my jaw tighten, my fists clench, and a fire build inside me that I hadn't felt in years. But I didn't rush in. Not yet. Because as much as I wanted to tear them apart, I knew that moments like these required control. I needed to see how far they would go. I needed to understand just how deep their arrogance ran. So I stayed hidden for a few moments longer, watching, listening, and letting every detail sear itself into my mind. Ethan tried to protest, his small voice trembling, but the men cut him off sharply. They demanded he hand over his bike, saying it would be confiscated as evidence. My son clutched the handlebars, his knuckles white, refusing to let go. That was when one of the men reached for him, his hand grabbing Ethan's arm with a force that was anything but neighborly. That was it. That was the moment my restraint snapped. I stepped forward, my voice booming across the park, the sound slicing through the air like a warning siren. Every head turned, the enforcers suddenly stiffening, their eyes narrowing as they realized they were no longer alone. My son's gaze met mine, filled with both relief and terror, and I knew this was just the beginning. Because while they thought they were dealing with just another family to bully, they had no idea who I really was. They didn't know the years I had spent facing down criminals, standing my ground against those who believed they were above the law. And they certainly didn't know that they had just made the worst mistake of their lives by trying to arrest the son of a state police officer. I took another step forward, my shadow stretching across the ground, my mind already racing with what was about to unfold. And in that moment, one thing became very clear: this wasn't just about Ethan anymore. This was about power, abuse, and the dangerous illusion of authority. And I was about to show them just how badly they had crossed the line. As I strode across the park, every step felt heavier, fueled by a rage I kept tightly caged behind years of discipline. My son's frightened face was burned into my mind, and the sight of those 3 men looming over him like prison guards only stoked the fire. I wasn't just a father anymore, I was a storm waiting to break. The enforcers stiffened as I approached. Their postures faltered, the arrogance that had been so bold seconds earlier beginning to crack. They weren't used to being confronted. They were used to compliance, to neighbors bowing their heads and submitting to the endless stream of petty citations and demands. But I wasn't like the others, and they were about to learn that the hard way. I didn't say a word yet. I let the silence hang heavy in the air, the tension thick enough to choke on. My uniform may have been at home in the closet, but the authority it represented lived in every inch of me. They didn't know me, not yet, but they would. Ethan clung to his bike, his eyes darting between me and the men. He wanted to run to me, I could see it in his trembling hands, but he held his ground, waiting. My son knew me well enough to understand that I was calculating, that I was building something bigger than a scene. The man with the clipboard cleared his throat and puffed out his chest, trying to reassert control. His attempt only made him look smaller. He gestured toward Ethan, muttering something about neighborhood violations and rules of conduct. His words sounded hollow, rehearsed, like a weak actor stumbling through lines in a bad play. And then it happened. One of them, the tallest, the one who had dared to grab Ethan's arm, shifted his weight toward me, his jaw tight, his expression daring me to challenge him. He didn't know he had already lost. He didn't know that the badge I carried wasn't just a symbol of authority, but of training, discipline, and power he couldn't even begin to understand. Still, I held back. Because I wanted them to keep digging their hole. The deeper they went, the harder it would be for them to climb out when the truth finally crushed them. So I let him speak. I let him spout his accusations about reckless biking and child endangerment. I let him wave his flimsy clipboard like it was a court order. I let them believe, for one more moment, that they had control. But when I heard him say the words, "We are authorized to detain him," something inside me snapped. Authorized? By whom? A board of retirees drunk on their own self-importance? A homeowners association with no real jurisdiction outside of lawn heights and mailbox colors? The audacity was staggering. I stepped closer, so close that the tallest man had to tilt his chin up to look at me. My presence swallowed the space between us, and for the first time, I saw hesitation flicker in his eyes. He still didn't know who I was, but he knew enough to sense danger. My silence was louder than any words could be. Ethan's breathing was ragged now, his small chest heaving as if every second felt like a lifetime. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I had seen enough. I reached into my pocket, not for a weapon, not for a badge, but for my phone. I raised it slowly, deliberately, and began recording. The reaction was immediate. The clipboard man stammered, his words faltering as he realized that power play was about to become evidence. The other two exchanged nervous glances, their bravado melting away like ice in the sun. They hadn't expected resistance. They had expected fear. And fear was the one thing I refused to give them. I held the phone steady, my voice calm but edged with steel as I narrated every detail for the recording. I described how 3 men in HOA uniforms had surrounded a minor, how they had threatened to confiscate his property, and how one of them had physically laid hands on him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The camera did all the work, stripping them bare of their imagined power. One of the men tried to interject, but his words crumbled into stutters. Another muttered something about misunderstanding. They were unraveling, and I hadn't even shown my hand yet. I could have stopped there. I could have let the recording be enough. But I wasn't just a father in that moment. I was a protector, not only of my son but of every family in this neighborhood who had been pushed around, silenced, and bullied. I lowered the phone, my hand steady, and let the silence stretch again. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached into my wallet and pulled out my badge. The metal glinted in the afternoon sun, a small object carrying the weight of authority none of them could ever hope to match. Their faces drained of color instantly. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The kids playing at the far end of the park fell silent, parents watching from their porches froze mid-step, and the 3 enforcers looked like statues about to topple. They knew what that badge meant. They knew they had crossed a line that couldn't be erased with excuses or paperwork. I didn't speak. I let the badge speak for me. The silence was deafening, filled only by the pounding of their guilt and the rising storm they had just unleashed upon themselves. And then, before any of them could muster a response, a voice from behind us shattered the moment. It was deep, authoritative, and brimming with the kind of confidence only a man in power could carry. I turned my head just enough to see him, the president of the HOA, striding toward us with a smug smile, as if this entire confrontation was nothing more than a show he had orchestrated. The enforcers straightened instantly, their fear replaced with forced confidence under their leader's gaze. My pulse quickened. I knew this man by reputation, controlling, manipulative, and unrelenting. If the enforcers were dangerous in their ignorance, he was far more dangerous in his arrogance. And as he approached, locking eyes with me, I realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This was only the beginning of a battle that would pit his false authority against my real one. The president of the HOA walked toward me like a man who believed the entire neighborhood was his kingdom, and we were all just subjects living under his rule. His posture was stiff, deliberate, his chin raised a fraction too high, and his eyes gleamed with that smug confidence I had seen on countless power-hungry men before. In my career as a state police officer, I had faced cartel leaders, corrupt politicians, and violent criminals who all carried that same look. It was the expression of a man who thought he was untouchable. Behind him, the 3 enforcers straightened, almost like soldiers waiting for their general. Their fear evaporated instantly under his gaze, and I realized that their arrogance came from him. They weren't acting on their own delusions, they were feeding off his. The president wasn't just another homeowner with a title. He was the puppeteer pulling every string in this HOA, and he had grown used to everyone dancing when he commanded. He stopped just a few feet from me, his shoes clicking sharply against the concrete. The air seemed to thicken with tension. The neighborhood had gone eerily quiet, as if every resident knew something was about to explode. From the corner of my eye, I could see curtains twitching, neighbors peeking out of their windows, their curiosity outweighing their fear. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was becoming a spectacle. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My badge was still in my hand, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. But the president's eyes barely flicked to it. He ignored it, deliberately, as though by refusing to acknowledge it, he could strip it of its power. He wanted control of the narrative, and he thought he could wrest it back from me. For a moment, he simply studied me, sizing me up the way predators do before deciding whether to strike. His lips curved into a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Then, without a single word, he gestured at the enforcers. His hand movement was small, but the message was clear: stand firm. And so they did. They didn't back down, didn't retreat, didn't apologize. Instead, they puffed out their chests again, as if the sight of their leader had recharged their courage. I could feel Ethan shift beside me, his small body pressing closer against my leg. He was still clutching his bike, still trembling, but I could sense something else in him now. He was watching me, learning from me, drawing strength from my refusal to bend. The president finally spoke, his tone calm but dripping with condescension. Though I won't repeat his exact words here, his message was clear. He believed Ethan had broken community rules, he believed the HOA had every right to take action, and he believed I was nothing more than another homeowner subject to his authority. He dismissed my badge as irrelevant. According to him, this was HOA territory, and in his mind, HOA rules outweighed everything else. I had heard delusions before, but this was on another level. As he spoke, I let his words wash over me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. Instead, I studied him the way I would study a suspect during an interrogation. Every pause, every flicker of his expression, every shift of his body told me something about the man. He wasn't just arrogant, he was dangerous. He believed so strongly in his own authority that he was willing to trample over anyone, even a child, to preserve it. When he finally stopped talking, the silence that followed was heavier than anything he had said. My grip on the badge tightened. I wanted to shut him down right there, to expose his ignorance in front of everyone watching. But I also knew something crucial. Timing was everything. If I struck too early, if I let anger cloud my judgment, he'd twist it against me. Men like him thrived on manipulation. Instead, I took a breath, steady and measured, and raised my phone again. The camera lens caught his face perfectly. His smug expression faltered for just a fraction of a second when he realized the entire neighborhood confrontation was now being documented, his every word preserved. That was when I saw it, the first crack in his armor. He quickly recovered, masking his unease with another condescending smirk, but it was too late. I had seen it. And once I saw a crack, I knew how to break the rest of the wall. But before I could press further, he made his move. With deliberate calm, he announced that the HOA would be filing formal action against my family. He spoke of fines, legal consequences, and hearings before the board. His voice carried across the park, loud enough for every eavesdropping neighbor to hear. It wasn't just a threat to me, it was a performance. He was reminding everyone else in the neighborhood what happened when you resisted him. It worked. I could feel the atmosphere shift. Some neighbors closed their curtains quickly, retreating from the conflict, unwilling to get involved. Others shook their heads, clearly sympathetic but too afraid to intervene. That was the power of fear, the kind of power this president had wielded for years. But he had miscalculated. He thought I was just another resident, just another man too scared of fines and intimidation to fight back. What he didn't realize was that I had spent my entire career dismantling men exactly like him, bullies who thrived on fear until someone finally stood tall enough to strip it away. I didn't respond to his threat. Not yet. Instead, I turned slightly toward Ethan, crouched down just enough to meet his eyes, and whispered something only he could hear, a promise that he was safe, that no one, not even the self-proclaimed rulers of this neighborhood, would ever hurt him again. Ethan's trembling eased, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of security. Then I rose, straightened, and locked eyes with the president once more. The weight of the badge in my hand felt heavier now, as though it were urging me forward, demanding that I act. But just as I was about to reveal my full authority, something unexpected happened. A woman's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. I turned toward the source, and my stomach twisted with recognition. It was one of the board members, a woman I had seen only a handful of times at community meetings. She wasn't usually outspoken, but now she was striding across the grass with a folder clutched tightly to her chest. Her eyes weren't on me, they were locked on the president. The way the enforcers shifted uncomfortably told me one thing: whatever she was carrying, it wasn't good news for him. And in that instant, I realized the battlefield was about to change. The fight wasn't just between me and the president anymore. It was about to crack wide open, exposing secrets the HOA had worked hard to keep buried. The woman marched across the park with a look of quiet determination, clutching the thick folder as though it were a weapon more powerful than any badge or law. The moment she appeared, I saw the president's expression tighten. It was subtle, a flicker of irritation behind the mask of arrogance, but it was there. He didn't want her here. He didn't want anyone interfering with the show of dominance he had staged. The enforcers shifted nervously. Their bravado from just moments ago began to fray again, their postures uncertain as they exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't loyal to the HOA itself, they were loyal to the man who controlled it. And now that man was being challenged, not by me, but by someone from within his own ranks. I didn't move. I simply watched, my badge still in my hand, my phone still recording, as the woman stopped a few feet from us. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her knuckles white against the folder, and I could see the battle in her eyes, fear against resolve. She was afraid, yes, but she was also finished with being silent. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge Ethan, didn't even address the enforcers. Her eyes were locked on the president, sharp and unyielding. Her lips pressed together before she finally spoke. I won't repeat her exact words here, but the essence was unmistakable. She accused him of overstepping, of twisting the HOA's rules to serve his own agenda, of hiding things from the rest of the board. And then she lifted the folder slightly, just enough for everyone to see the stack of papers inside, and declared that she had proof. For the first time since he had arrived, the president's smugness cracked. His jaw clenched, his smile faltered, and his eyes darted to the folder like a predator spotting a rival weapon. He barked something dismissive, trying to brush her off as if she were hysterical or misinformed. But his voice wavered. I knew that tone well. It was the tone of a man trying to mask panic. The neighbors watching from their windows leaned closer. I could almost feel the neighborhood holding its breath. They had seen this president command, intimidate, and dominate for years. But now, for the first time, someone was standing against him from within his own empire. And it wasn't me, it was one of his own board members. Ethan clung tighter to my leg, his eyes wide with confusion. He didn't understand the full weight of what was unfolding, but he could sense the shift. The power dynamics of the park had changed. The president wasn't untouchable anymore. The woman opened the folder and pulled out a stack of documents, waving them for everyone to see. They were copies of financial statements, board meeting notes, and violation records. She accused him of fabricating citations, inflating fines, and even misusing HOA funds for his own benefit. Each accusation was another blow, another crack splintering through the facade he had built. The president's face darkened. He stepped toward her, his voice low, sharp, laced with venom. It wasn't the public performance voice he had used on me. It was the voice of a man cornered, the mask slipping to reveal the fury underneath. But what he didn't realize was that my phone was still recording every word, every twitch of his expression, every threat that left his lips. And the more he spoke, the more incriminating he became. The enforcers looked unsettled now, their eyes flicking between their leader and the woman. They weren't used to seeing him rattled. Doubt was beginning to seep into their loyalties. And doubt was dangerous. It spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction rising in my chest. For so long, this man had ruled through fear, bending the community to his will. But fear only worked as long as people believed he was untouchable. The moment they saw him bleed, the illusion shattered. And right now, he was bleeding in front of the entire neighborhood. But then, just as quickly, he regained control. He straightened, smoothed the front of his suit jacket, and forced that arrogant smile back onto his face. With calculated calm, he announced that the woman was a disgruntled board member, that her so-called evidence was fabricated nonsense, and that anyone who believed her was naive. His words dripped with manipulation, his tone steady and confident once more. And to my frustration, I saw some of the neighbors hesitate. His grip on them was strong, forged over years of intimidation and subtle control. Even with evidence waved in their faces, some still doubted. That was the true danger of a man like him, his ability to twist reality until people didn't know what to believe. The woman's face flushed red with anger and frustration, but she didn't back down. She pressed the documents against his chest, forcing him to grab them to keep them from falling. The gesture wasn't just symbolic, it was bold, defiant. It told him, and everyone watching, that she wasn't afraid anymore. He glared at her, his mask slipping again, his knuckles tightening around the papers. And for a heartbeat, I thought he might lash out physically. My instincts flared, my muscles tensed, ready to step in if he crossed that line. But then he did something worse. He turned his head toward me, his eyes narrowing, and declared that my son's case would be escalated directly to the board. He announced, with a chilling calmness, that Ethan would be banned from using any community spaces until a formal hearing could be held. His words echoed through the park like a gavel striking. The enforcers straightened again, emboldened by his declaration. The neighbors gasped softly, the weight of his announcement pressing down on the atmosphere. And Ethan, my boy's small frame stiffened, his grip on his bike tightening until his knuckles turned white. He didn't fully understand what a hearing meant, but he knew enough to realize he was being punished. That was the final straw. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. This wasn't about bending rules or flexing authority. This was about targeting a child, my child, and using him as leverage in a power struggle. My pulse thundered in my ears as I straightened to my full height. The badge in my hand felt like it was burning, demanding to be unleashed, demanding justice. I was done watching. Done waiting. Done calculating. But just as I opened my mouth to finally reveal the full weight of who I was and what authority I carried, the woman with the folder gasped loudly. Her eyes widened as though she had just realized something far worse, something buried in those documents that even she hadn't fully processed before. And when she raised her head to speak, her voice trembled with shock. The woman's gasp pierced through the tension like a blade. Every eye in the park shifted toward her, and for a fleeting second, the arrogant composure of the HOA president faltered. He didn't expect it. He hadn't expected her to see whatever was buried in those pages. Her hands trembled as she flipped quickly through the documents, scanning line after line, her lips moving silently as if she couldn't believe the words staring back at her. Then she froze. Her face drained of color, and her eyes flicked up, locking with the president's. It wasn't just anger in her expression now, it was fear. And that fear told me one thing: she had stumbled onto something big. The president saw it too. His reaction was swift, almost panicked. He reached for the folder, snapping his hand out like a striking snake, but she pulled it back against her chest. The papers bent under her grip, but she didn't let go. That single tug-of-war, that physical struggle over the evidence, spoke louder than any words could have. This wasn't just about HOA fines anymore. This was about secrets worth hiding. The neighbors gasped again, whispering among themselves, their curiosity sharpening into suspicion. They were seeing their president for who he truly was, a man desperate to keep control, even if it meant clawing at a woman's hands in broad daylight. I moved instinctively, stepping closer, ready to intervene if he tried to escalate further. My badge still glinted in my hand, but he pretended not to notice, pretending he still held the upper hand. But the cracks in his empire were spreading fast, and he knew it. Finally, the woman broke the silence. Her voice shook, but her words carried the weight of a hammer striking stone. She accused him of funneling HOA funds into his personal accounts, of creating fake violation records to justify fines, of using the money not for neighborhood upkeep but for his own luxuries. And then she said the words that made my blood run cold. There were bank transfers, signed and approved by him, that connected directly to accounts outside the state. Fraud. Embezzlement. Criminal activity hidden under the mask of neighborhood management. The murmurs from the neighbors grew louder, sharper, tinged with outrage. For years, they had suspected the fines and fees were excessive, but suspicion had always been drowned out by fear. Now, in one moment, the truth was laid bare in black and white. The president's face twisted into a mask of fury. His voice rose, louder than ever, dripping with venom as he accused her of betrayal, of falsifying documents, of conspiring to destroy the community. He tried to spin it, to turn himself into the victim. But his voice cracked, his words rushed, his mask of control slipping further with every syllable. And I knew it was time. For too long, I had let him play his game. For too long, I had watched him wield fear like a weapon. But now, with my son still clutching my leg and my neighbor's eyes wide with desperation, I couldn't hold back anymore. I lifted my badge high, the metal catching the fading sunlight, and finally spoke with the full weight of authority I had been holding in reserve. My voice was calm but thunderous, carrying across the park like a final verdict. I declared myself for what I was, a state police officer. I told them the truth, that what I had witnessed wasn't just harassment but unlawful detention, attempted intimidation of a minor, and now, potentially, financial fraud on a scale far beyond neighborhood politics. The shift was immediate. The neighbors gasped audibly, some even stepping closer as though my words had given them courage. The enforcers froze, their arrogance collapsing into wide-eyed fear. And the president, he stood there, stone still, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and panic. I could almost see the calculations racing through his mind. He wasn't just worried about losing control of the neighborhood anymore, he was worried about prison. Ethan clung tighter to me, his eyes wide, but for the first time that day, I felt his small body relax ever so slightly. He understood now. He understood that his father wasn't just a man in jeans and a t-shirt. He was someone who could protect him against anything, even the monsters disguised as neighbors. The woman with the folder looked at me, relief flooding her expression. She handed me the documents without hesitation, her hands shaking as she passed them over. I flipped through the pages quickly, my trained eyes scanning the details. It was all there, dates, amounts, signatures, accounts. Enough to raise more than suspicion, enough to trigger a full-scale investigation. The president realized it too. His mask cracked completely now, his face a storm of desperation. He barked orders at the enforcers, demanding they confiscate the documents, insisting that I had no jurisdiction here. His voice was frantic, sharp, but the enforcers didn't move. They were frozen, trapped between loyalty to their leader and fear of the law I represented. That silence, his own men refusing to act, was the loudest sound of all. But then, something unexpected happened. He didn't back down. He didn't crumble. Instead, he turned to the crowd of neighbors, his eyes wild, and began shouting about conspiracies, about outsiders trying to destroy their community, about enemies hiding in plain sight. He spun his desperation into a speech, a frantic plea for loyalty. And to my disbelief, a few neighbors actually nodded. Fear and habit had rooted too deeply in them. Even in the face of evidence, some clung to his authority like a lifeline. That was when I realized just how dangerous he truly was. A man willing to sacrifice truth, morality, even children's safety, just to hold on to power. The woman beside me whispered that there was more in the folder, more than even she had realized. She urged me to keep it safe. Her fear wasn't just for herself anymore. It was for anyone who dared to oppose him. I knew then that this battle wasn't over. This wasn't something I could end with a badge and a stern warning. This was bigger. Deeper. Darker. The president's voice grew louder, his desperation spilling into madness. And then, as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the park, he made a declaration that chilled me to my core. He announced that anyone who sided against him would be stripped of their community privileges, fined to the maximum extent, and if necessary, forcibly removed from their homes. His words hung heavy in the air, like the final threat of a tyrant unwilling to surrender. And as I looked around at my neighbors, torn between fear and awakening courage, I realized that the real war was only beginning. The president's declaration echoed in the fading light, his words like poison dripping into the veins of the neighborhood. He stood tall, puffed up with a desperation that masqueraded as strength, but in reality, he looked more like a cornered animal than a leader. His threat, that families would be fined, stripped of privileges, or even forced from their homes, was the final straw. For years he had wielded fear like a weapon, but now he wielded it openly, without disguise, and the effect wasn't what he expected. Fear had always been his strength, but fear has limits. And in that moment, something shifted in the crowd. I saw it first in the eyes of one elderly man, a long-time resident who had always kept his head down. His lips pressed into a firm line, and he shook his head slowly. Then, a mother holding her toddler stepped forward, her body trembling but her eyes steady with defiance. Soon, murmurs of disapproval rippled through the group, louder and louder, until they became a wave of voices rising against him. The president tried to shout over them, but his voice cracked. He tried to gesture wildly, demanding obedience, but the authority he once commanded had evaporated into the night air. I stood in the center of it all, the folder of evidence clutched in my hands, Ethan still by my side. My heart pounded, not with fear anymore, but with purpose. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment to finally bring him down. I announced that the documents in my possession would be turned over to state investigators. I explained what they contained: financial fraud, misuse of funds, unlawful intimidation, and threats that bordered on criminal extortion. I told them, with a calm finality, that the days of his unchecked power were over. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others gasped, and a few neighbors wept openly, as if years of silent oppression were suddenly lifting off their shoulders. The enforcers, the same men who had once dragged people off their lawns for minor violations, now stood frozen, glancing between me and their president like soldiers who no longer knew who commanded them. And then came the breaking point. The woman who had handed me the folder stepped forward again. Her voice, steady now, carried across the park as she revealed what she had found in the remaining pages. Not only had he stolen funds, but he had also falsified maintenance reports, covering up safety hazards that had led to multiple injuries in the community. He hadn't just stolen money, he had gambled with people's lives. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Neighbors shouted in anger, some stepping toward him, their fists clenched, their patience gone. The president backed away, his composure shattering completely, his face twisted in panic. For the first time, he looked small. Weak. Defenseless. But even then, he tried one last desperate move. He declared that none of this mattered because the HOA had immunity, that no one could touch him, that his authority was absolute. His voice was shrill, broken, like a child caught in a lie. I stepped forward, holding my badge high, and told him he was wrong. HOA bylaws might give him control over lawns and fences, but they did not protect him from state law. Fraud was fraud. Intimidation was intimidation. And crimes, no matter how cleverly disguised, were still crimes. The crowd roared with approval, and in that moment, the enforcers finally broke ranks. They lowered their arms, stepped back, and left him standing alone. The empire he had built crumbled before his eyes, not with the swing of a hammer but with the quiet, collective refusal of those he once controlled. I called for backup, and within the hour, state investigators arrived. Their presence was like a cleansing fire sweeping through the park. They took the documents, interviewed witnesses, and began their work with methodical precision. The president raged, screamed, threatened lawsuits and retaliation, but none of it mattered anymore. His words fell flat, powerless, against the weight of truth and law. When they finally placed him in handcuffs, silence fell over the crowd. For years, they had seen him as untouchable, larger than life, a man who controlled every detail of their existence. And now, he stood shackled, his head bowed, his future unraveling before their eyes. Ethan squeezed my hand tightly, his voice small as he asked if it was finally over. I bent down, looking into his eyes, and told him the truth. Yes, it was over, for us, and for everyone who had lived under the shadow of that man's reign. But as I stood there, watching the investigators lead him away, I also knew something else. This wasn't just about one man's downfall. This was about a community remembering its own strength, about neighbors realizing that fear only has power if they allow it. The days and weeks that followed brought change. The HOA board was dissolved, its accounts frozen, and a temporary committee formed to ensure fair governance until proper elections could be held. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear now came together, united by what they had endured. Fences were mended, not by order but by choice. Yards blossomed with flowers, laughter filled the park again, and children played freely without the shadow of enforcers looming over them. As for me, I returned to my work as a state officer, but with a renewed sense of purpose. I had always believed in justice, but this experience reminded me that justice wasn't only found in courts or cases. Sometimes, justice began in your own backyard. Ethan recovered too. For a while, he was still wary of strangers, still hesitant when he saw uniforms. But over time, with patience and love, he learned that not all authority was cruel. That day in the park had shown him that his father could protect him, that truth could win, and that courage, even when it trembled, was stronger than fear. And the president? He faced trial for his crimes. Fraud, embezzlement, reckless endangerment, the list was long, and the evidence undeniable. His name, once a source of intimidation, became a cautionary tale whispered in courtrooms and community meetings alike. But for me, the most powerful moment came weeks later, when Ethan and I walked through the park again. The sun was shining, the grass freshly cut, and children laughed as they raced each other down the path. Ethan turned to me, his eyes bright, and said he wasn't afraid anymore. And in that moment I knew it had all been worth it. The tyrant was gone. The fear was broken. And our home was truly ours again.